Welcome to the ResponderStrong Mental Health Curriculum, brought to you by All Clear Foundation. All Clear Foundation is a national nonprofit that supports emergency responders and their family members in their overall well-being and longevity. When we talk about emergency responders, we're referring to those, career or volunteer, who are trained to serve their communities in times of emergency, disaster, or crisis. This includes law enforcement, fire, EMS, dispatch, corrections, ski patrol, disaster workers, healthcare workers, and the list goes on. What we find is there's a commonality among these populations, not only in their personality and their motivations, but in their exposures occupationally, in the field and in the hospital. And these exposures can oftentimes lead to very normal human impacts. We're here today to help empower you and equip you with the tools to better manage those exposures of the job. My name's Rhonda Kelly. I'm a retired firefighter paramedic and former ER Psych ER nurse. I'm currently serving as the Executive Director for All Clear Foundation, and I'm happy to be here today to present with two other master trainers.
I'm Brandon Druna. I'm the CEO of Eagle County Health District, and I've been a paramedic for about 20 years. Started my career in New Orleans and have been in sort of EMS management for about a decade. I'm also a professor at the University of Denver, where we teach leadership, which this is a huge component of.
Hello, my name is Craig Bettis. I'm a retired police commander after 22 years of service, recently retired, and currently I'm serving as a Director of Development for Stigma Tactical Wellness, which is a preventative health management program for first responders.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining us today. So, if you are participating in this class, we would really appreciate it if you would take just a minute or two to hit this QR code and take the pre-assessment. This data is anonymized, it's confidential. We are using it merely to monitor the impact of our content and to make sure that we're still on track. With the past couple years and the increasing stress in our professions, we know that our needs are rapidly evolving, and participating in this survey is a way to help make sure that we stay on track. We will ask you to complete it again at the end of the course. An outline, what we're planning to cover today, is defining the problem, and the problem is stress, how we manage the stress that is inherent in all of our careers and our volunteer activities. What the physiology of stress looks like, talk a little bit about the stress injury model, talk about post-traumatic stress injury, what it looks like, how to mitigate it, and how to prevent it, suicide awareness and prevention among our ranks, and resiliency, because ultimately if we want to prevent all of these negative impacts, keeping our resilience skills up and strong is the best way that we can do so. So why are we here?
Well, I mean, I think that it's pretty clear that we in our industry have had some challenges with the impact of the things that we experience and the stress that then befalls us during the course of our careers. And as we make this, I think what we consider a sea change, both in our individual responder culture, but also our greater culture, we need to sort of better understand how this stuff impacts us, get kind of into the nitty-gritty of the physiology of how it changes the way we engage in our everyday work, the things we do to try to mitigate it that are good and that aren't so good, and then some real tools that you can take with you to start making the turn and having a healthier and better adjusted lifestyle.
Yeah, and I think as we're seeing, as Brandon mentioned, it's kind of a testament to this new kind of wave of first responders paying attention to what's really going on with them in their industry, not just their mental health, their physical health, how all these things impact us when we talk about stress and rates of suicide, but really giving you, again, the tools, hopefully walking away from something like this with some tools so you can understand how, when you start this job, whether you're further in your career, 10, 15 years, or you're just beginning your career in a first responder capacity, that all these things are here available for you in the information and the education. We'd also like to recognize that we understand that some of these topics can be tough wherever you might be sitting, listening to them. There could be things that come up for you personally. Feel free at any time to pause, take a break, and come back when you're ready. If you feel like you need to talk to someone, please reach out and do so.
The statistics are oftentimes very shocking to emergency responders. In the past, we haven't really talked about the mental or the emotional impacts of the job. But research is showing, we believe we're capturing about 40% of the actual occurrence of suicidality But even with that low reporting rate, law enforcement officers and firefighters are 2 to 3 times more likely to take their own life than to suffer another line of duty death, which is just an atrocious statistic.
And we have access to sorts of things that other, folks that are not in our industry wouldn't have. And when you look at EMS professionals in particular, we have a higher rate. We're also much, much better at succeeding when we attempt. And that's because we have a sort of detailed understanding of physiology, and we know what is necessary to complete suicide. So it's really important to recognize that we not only are affected by the sort of stress that we experience every day, but we are better prepared to make these challenging decisions just by the virtue of the fact that we have a knowledge that the typical suicidal person wouldn't have.
And I think it's okay to recognize, we talk about the law enforcement and firefighters being 2 to 3 times higher. I mean, it's estimated that 50% of firefighters have thought about suicide, 20% have even considered a plan. But when we talk about in particular how our environment or a particular discipline of the first responder community, for example, Brandon mentioned EMS professionals and their role in that way. But in corrections officers in particular, we also see this as a higher rate of suicide. And a lot of this can have to do with the environment. I think it's pretty obvious for those of you who either work in corrections or those of you that can, from the outside looking in, you can understand that's a challenging environment for someone. There's a lot of isolation. There's a constant fear of threat on one's life. If you're in a corrections officer role, there's some things in that environment that are unique. So understanding why those might have a higher rate or tendency to have a higher rate have not just have to do with what we experience on the job, but also sometimes our environment.
And when we highlight these professions, it's not that these are the only ones that have these heightened risks. It is that these are the ones who've been most studied. So we recognize that disaster workers also have severely heightened incidences of not only suicidality, but depression, anxiety. We see it in healthcare workers. The rates of burnout in healthcare, nurses in particular, over the past couple of years have led to an exodus outside of the profession. People leaving the work that they were passionate about and now taking off to do something else entirely because they just can't do it. And we'll talk a little bit more about burnout. We also recognize ski patrol. It's really challenging when your happy place is in the mountains to witness the trauma and the stressors and to juxtapose that with how can this happen in this place. So there are a lot of challenges across all of our branches. The one big similarity and the unifying thing for all of us is that it is a human behind the badge, the uniform, the scrubs, the headset, and that these things that we're talking about are very normal human impacts due to the exposures that we have encountered. The good news in that is that we can better equip ourselves to manage those exposures in a constructive way, and we'll talk more about that later.
It's also probably important to recognize the context in which we have this conversation. We are now 2.5 years away from this fundamental change in our society as we emerge, however you want to say, we transcend the emergency of COVID and we start moving into this new reality. How is that affecting us? How is this emergency part of the pandemic as it sort of fades, how are we now engaging this new reality, and how do we have to be really cautious about our own mental health and our own practice of caring for ourselves in this sort of post-COVID world.
And we really love this quote, compared to shame, death is nothing. We know that our culture, the emergency responder culture, has really played a significant role in some of our negative outcomes. We collected the branches to work together under the broad umbrella of the emergency responder term, recognizing that our professions, arguably, no matter what our role is, our single greatest exposure over the course of our career is to the intense trauma and suffering of other people. Unfortunately, we have traditionally done that in the absence of any preparation, this type of content, to teach us that empathy and compassion are two of our greatest skill sets and strengths, but they can also be pathways for stress injury for us. And the third compounding factor that we all share is that our cultures have traditionally been eat our own. Any admission of mental or emotional impact from the job has traditionally been met with a resounding response of, you must be weak. Maybe this just isn't for you. And this is really what we're focused on with this content, to empower us individually to change our culture so that we recognize that strength is working through our challenges and growing from them and working together rather than shaming those or hiding in shame.
I think, just the culture of toughness is a phrase that has been used before. And I always, when I hear that, I always think about my first day on the job and the people that I idolized as a brand new EMT. And I look back on those folks now with my experience, and I recognize that what I was really after was people that were burned out. And what was sort of held high in our industry was the people that were really emotionally scarred from trauma. And our culture embraced those people, and the people that really were challenged and had to cope with those sorts of things were really cast aside. And what we're doing now is we're making this change so that those folks, we recognize the damage and we're trying to help them. But we got to move our culture away from sort of holding those people on high, and instead we need to idolize the people that are healthy emotionally and they feel things and they're willing to come forward and say that things affected them. That's the place we need to move towards.
And if you're in a position where you're going to be implementing any of these things, talking about educating, it's important, as Brandon said, they don't care that we know until they know that we care. And we have to care about these things. And that's important for that change to happen.
Love that. So we're not trying to change that we honor strength, we're changing how we define strength. I get excited about this one. Yes. So Thomas Joyner, suicidologist out of Florida State University. I've been cyber stalking him for years. He's done a lot of research around emergency responders, started with the fire service and has really expanded. Google him, he's got a tremendous amount of research out there. He's where we draw a lot of our statistics from. But he really looked years ago at fire service and said, hey, here's this group of passionate people who are physically fit, who have meaning and purpose in their life. They're coming in selected to be healthy to this profession. And on the back end, we're seeing insane rates of suicide. Why is this happening? What's happening in the gap? What he did was apply the interpersonal theory of suicide to the emergency responder experience. We all have a pretty high threshold for self-preservation. It's just wired into us as humans. And when we're healthy, it's hardwired. What he found is two things need to happen for us to even begin thinking about taking our own life.
The first thing is we need to have sort of a thwarted sense of belongingness. So we need to start sort of feeling as though we're on an island, we're isolated. And you know, this happens especially in cultures where there's not a rich willingness to share trauma and challenge. So one might have an experience and they really feel as though they're the only one that's ever had this experience, and they're certainly the only one that's ever responded this way. And if you don't have the ability to crosswalk with other people and have conversations that help you understand that you're not alone, you really can sink deeply into this idea that there's no one else that's ever sort of been impacted in the same way that you have.
Well, and I love that Brandon brings that up. We were talking earlier before we started filming about trauma bonding, that lots of times when responders do get together, they talk about the details of the call rather than how they feel and how the call is impacting them. And that can really contribute to this thwarted sense of belongingness. Oh, everybody's jazzed about the details of the call. I must be the only one who's feeling this way. And you're not. That's juxtaposed. Thwarted sense of belongingness, I am alone, which oftentimes in our mind is I'm weak. Perceived sense of burdensomeness, I am a burden. That's the other thing that Joyner found that has to be happening for us to begin contemplating taking our own life, to get to that point of suicidal ideation. And I think back to the beginning of my career, how many of the older firefighters who were getting close to retirement, I would hear say, just casually offhand, it would be so much better for my family if I just died on the job. Wow. At the time, I didn't understand it, but this is exactly what it was. Feeling like you have nothing else to contribute but maybe a death benefit. Feeling that you're not really there, you're not connected emotionally with your family, that you're not as strong, you're not as tough as your crew, that you're not really contributing on scenes, that there's really nothing left. And what a horrible way to feel.
Go ahead. Oh, please. And what you see is as these two things begin to happen in one's life, you know, this thwarted belongingness, I'm alone, I'm a burden. What we also have, which is environmentally, again, speaking to the profession, whatever it may be, is this ability, what we call acquired capacity in the first responder community, where you're kind of surrounded by a lot of what you deal with is that trauma, exposure to death, access to certain things, whether it be weapons and drugs. We know how this world exists. And when we live in that world, it's easier for us to cross that line line in consideration of thinking about suicide, making a non-lethal attempt, having a plan, things like that. So as you see these circles come together, that last piece is this acquired capacity piece, which is already built into our environment, and it's easier for us to somewhat step over that line.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I love what Dr. Joyner did here is he said, okay, it's one thing to start thinking about ending your own life, but again, a healthy brain does not contemplate its own destruction. So what moves us to that point of being able to take the action? Because that is a huge step. And like Craig talked about, it's the capacity. And you think about it on the job. How many times do we witness or respond to a suicide attempt, a successful or a completed suicide, gunshot wounds? When we're exposed to that, we kind of become callous to it. And our stressed brain, when we start going down into these downward spirals that Brandon will talk about later, it can honestly start to seem like a solution. This is the way to end my pain. I've seen it done before. I know how to do it. Other things in our job that can really increase our capacity is just the self-denial that's inherent in our roles, which operationally necessary. If you're a firefighter, you gotta run into the building burning, the burning building. You can't just go the other way. If you're a law enforcement officer and somebody is shooting at you, you have to engage. You can't just duck and cover. If you are a nurse and your patient has something highly contagious, you need to take the steps to protect yourself, but you need to go in and take care of your patient. I mean, there were so many ways that we're taught to put our safety second, which is fine operationally, and put others first. The problem is most of us weren't taught how to turn that switch off, so we tend to do that throughout our life. The other things we see on the job, aside from the exposure or potential exposure, is that you can't just quit because you're tired. You can't just quit because you're hungry. Doesn't matter that you're thirsty. You're taught to really work through these things, and that's where Dr. Joyner really thinks responders have gotten that capacity to start thinking about it and then actually take the action. So why are responders more at risk than the general public? We've touched on it.
Yeah, I mean, there's, when I start thinking about this, it's easy to sort of go to the, you know, we are desensitized and we experience a lot of trauma and we have sort of maladaptive coping mechanisms like alcohol use. But really, I think the thing, as I've been teaching this more and more, the thing that really resonates with me is shift work and sleep. Shift work and sleep. The fact that, especially those of us that are working 24 and 48-hour shifts and night shifts, you know, we just aren't ever getting to a recuperative state. And so our bodies and brains are stressed all the time. And we you know, we're going to talk a little bit about resilience later, but the idea that somehow your tank is at a quarter and you can still deal with really challenging trauma is just, you know, not something that is consistent with reality. So it's really important for us to recognize that we need to make sure that we're getting the right kind of sleep. But that's the thing that always gets to me, the sleep fatigue and shift.
Yeah, and if I could expand on what Brandon, I couldn't agree more with him in relation to where we see probably being one of the higher risk categories. And we all know how important sleep is. And there's quite a few studies out there in relation to first responders and lack of sleep in diagnosed sleep disorders. So really working towards that, and we're going to talk about when we get to some of the tools and practices. But the other thing aside from shift work is this never off duty. It's kind of, again, when we speak about culture, it's kind of one of those things that gets ingrained from the very beginning. Whatever you start your career in a fire academy, a police academy, whatever it may be, is there's a state of vigilance that we tend to live in. And that's the word that when I refer to stress or high stress environments, yes, we have forms of high stress environments, but we also tend to bring some of that stress on through never off duty, the state of vigilance that we live in. And those have very deleterious effects to not just physical health, but mental health.
We see that in the career professions, in the urban areas, but it's also very, very prominent in the small and rural communities and in the volunteer communities who are literally never off the clock and who oftentimes, when they do respond, are responding not to strangers, but to at least acquaintances, if not friends or family, and then who are integrated into the community. And when there's a negative outcome, it can be very, very challenging to feel like one is a value, to feel like one belongs to that community, going back to Thomas Joyner's work. So this can be a particular point of challenge for those in small, rural, and volunteer communities.
We were just patting ourselves in the back in Colorado because we were looking at stats and we found that a large majority of EMS calls in Colorado have a paramedic on scene. And one of the rural paramedics said that's great, but do you guys recognize that a lot of those rural organizations, there's only one paramedic, they just happen to go on every single call because they feel like because they're the only person in their community that can provide that service, they just have to be available 24 hours a day.
Absolutely. Some of the other risk factors that increase the odds of stress injury and suicidality for emergency responders are pretty common. We talked about shift work, high stress environment, not having time to recover from one call to the next, and we'll talk a lot more about the cumulative impacts of these exposures. We touched on the high incidence of alcohol use. In our culture, alcohol has kind of glorified, as are many of the signs of stress injury, to Brandon's point earlier, that not only is it condoned, it's actually reinforced in our culture. And that has traditionally been one of the ways that we cope, quote unquote, with our stressors and challenges, not realizing that we're actually worsening them, that it is a maladaptive coping mechanism. Go ahead.
I was going to say that the other real important note on this list is the availability of weapons. So we know law enforcement obviously has access to weapons, but we, I think, generally have sort of a culture that is more apt to have access to weapons, and we know that the availability of access to a handgun significantly increases the likelihood when someone is sort of in this mental state of them being successful. So it's really important for us to recognize how weapons and really just ease goes along with the same, paramedics and EMTs have a better ability to be successful because of our understanding of physiology. Anything that sort of shortens the time frame from, having this thought to being successful will increase the risk significantly.
And lastly, the thing we talk about, which is why we're here today, why we're talking to all of you, is this concept around the fear of shame. You see that on there a couple times: fear, shame of failure, letting one down, stigma that's attached to it, whether you're in part of a culture where that stigma is present. That is something that we recognize as well in some of the high risk.
And just to touch once more on availability of weapons, weapons aren't just firearms. EMS, we see a lot of overdoses, access to the NARC box. Healthcare professionals, we also see the same. With firefighters, high-angle rescue, search and rescue. Unfortunately, we see ropes used, hangings. There are a wide variety of means to take one's life in a rapid manner, and we see among responders that they tend to gravitate towards the means that they're most comfortable with or have the most access to. Back to Thomas Joyner's work, it is really challenging to get ourselves into that space where we're willing to take the action to end our life. That period is usually hard to sustain. It doesn't last for a long time. Ideation can last for a very long time. So removal of the weapons, making them just a little bit harder to get to, a little more difficult to get to the means, can make a huge difference in the outcome for that individual responder. So many years ago, I was involved in a training at the fire department with all of our officers around suicidality. And we asked all the officers, safe space, everybody just give us your honest opinion. How many people think that once you're suicidal, you're always suicidal? Stand on this side of the room. How many think that suicidal ideation is something that can be recovered from? Stand on this side of the room. And what we found was the room was split. There are a lot of responders, there's a lot of people in general who think that suicidality is weakness and think that once you're there, it's a permanent condition. That is absolutely not true. All of us have that innate sense of self-preservation. All of us can experience losses to such a degree that we are in so much pain, we begin to start contemplating taking our own life. And one of the best examples we've seen of that is just to sit here and think about the 3 things that give your life purpose and meaning. The reason you get out of bed in the morning, the 3 things that make you love life. We all have them. So just think about them to yourself. And now think you wake up next Monday and one of those things is gone. Maybe your fault, maybe not, but it's irrevocably gone. Can you see that maybe you're in a less stable position than you are right now? And if you go another week and you lose the second thing on your list, wow, it's another blow and you haven't had time to recover from the loss of the first one. You go a few more days and lose the third. Can you imagine? Look at your list. Those 3 things are now gone from your life. Can you imagine that you would be in a place of such great pain that maybe taking your own life would be your solution? As an example of that, we have an unfortunately extreme story of a police officer who had been on his agency about 3 years, wanted to be a cop since the time he was a little boy. Nobody gave him a fire engine in time to divert his course. But Worked all his life to get this career. Got it on cloud 9, married his high school sweetheart. Life is good. They're at a cop party. And what are they doing? What you do at any responder party. Drinking and swapping stories. A little ways into the night, his wife comes up to him in front of his buddies, who he's trying to impress, and says, "Hey, I think you've had too much to drink. Can you give me the keys?" He gets defensive. He doesn't want to look bad. He doesn't want to look weak. He tells her, "I can handle my liquor. Don't worry about it." She goes away. They wind up leaving the party. He gets in the driver's seat. She gets in the passenger seat. Unfortunately, on the way home, they wreck. She dies, and his life is thrown into turmoil. In a suicide note, he said, I killed the person I love most in the world. I ruined the career I've worked for all my life. And God can't punish me enough. What were his 3 things? His wife, his career, and his faith. When he lost all 3 of those things, he felt he had no other option. And there's a lesson in that. It doesn't have to be as extreme as this, but a lesson in that is we see so many people who say, I would never take my own life because I have my faith, because it is against my faith. And unfortunately, any strength, any support can also be used as a weapon. And oftentimes when we get into our own place of feeling like we don't belong, that we are a burden, we turn those tools, those supports, into a weapon that we use against ourselves. But again, it doesn't have to be that extreme an example. No,
and to Rhonda's example, I mean, it overlays what she just briefly mentioned, the Joiner's theory on suicidality, and that if you look at that example, those things were removed from him rather quickly. And I like to think of it as like an analogy of a 3-legged stool. If you're trying to have a stool and you're trying to sit on it, you lose one of those legs, you're going to be pretty off balance in life. You lose both of those legs, chances are you're going down to the ground. All 3, you're already on the ground. So I use that when I teach this and talk about it sometimes. But you know, when we talk about that extreme case, that is what it is. It's an extreme case, but it's not uncommon for in a career and certain things, there's a lot of potential for slippery slopes, incidents to occur where one of those things might happen. It might not be a tragedy such as a loss of life, but losing one's job. Suffering the court of public opinion with social media and everything else. Sometimes things can quickly spiral out of control when we're involved in an incident, and how that might make us feel isolated. Some of our work environment might be product of that. So some of these can come by way of a little bit smaller things in such a monumental tragedy that could happen in life, and we need to pay attention to that. It's what we take away from it and how we feel when we walk away from something like that. And if those things start to present themselves in that lack of belongingness or burdensomeness, we need to be aware.
I think it's also important to recognize how intimately related the 3 things are. So it's easy to sit here and say, yeah, but you know, I have these 3 things and they're not, you know, what are the chances that it all happens at the same time? But the reality is it's almost like dominoes. I mean, you have sort of, especially in our industry, a lot of your relationships are also very, very entrenched in your work, and all of those things sort of are very, very closely related. So it is surprising, but it's more likely than one would expect that as this dominoes start to fall, the sort of likelihood of the next one falling sort of increases. And so it's important to diversify the support that we have and build structures and relationships outside of that stuff, so we have more resilience when those sort of challenging things do befall us.
So I think we all know this as responders. The issue of confidentiality is the #1 barrier to responders seeking help. We've all traditionally been terrified that word's going to get out, that we're going to become part of the grapevine, that we are going to be viewed as weak, that it's going to have negative repercussions on our career path or our promotional ability. The #1 thing we can do to counter that is to be a safe and trusted coworker, to know that we have to honor. There are sometimes a duty to report if somebody's saying an imminent harm to themselves, they have a plan, they have the means, etc., but we can do so in a kind and caring, supportive way. Short of that, which is what most peer contacts are, maintaining just integrity around that interaction, being a safe, confidential person that someone can talk to. Many times, early in the stages of stress accumulation, all we really need is to talk to somebody who understands, who hears us and listens.
I like to look at this through the leadership lens because that's kind of my context. But Google did a study. They tried to figure out what's the most important thing for team performance. What teams really are at a high level and what do they do in common that makes them successful. And they found the single most important thing for team performance is emotional safety. So that is not what anyone, I think, would expect when they start thinking about this stuff. But emotional safety, without a doubt, is absolutely paramount to have any sort of success with any sort of groups of people working together. So as a leader of an EMS organization, my thrust and goal is to change the culture of the way we talk about mental health. So I have absolutely been exposed to trauma. I've absolutely had challenges related to that. I seek out therapy, and I'm totally open with my staff about that, because I think it's incredibly important for us to change the paradigm from a cultural perspective, because you should never have fear of losing your job or not being seen in the same light or losing stature because you are affected by a traumatic situation that you were thrust in because of your job.
And ultimately, when we do seek the appropriate treatment and we do heal and recover, we are far more effective. We are able to perform better in our job and in our lives, and we are safer and better support all these things we say we want to our coworkers. And yet we have stigmatized seeking the appropriate mental health in the past, when it's actually what provides us what we really want.
The other part of that too that's really important is, if you are a leader in your organization, or if you're in an organization that have leaders that have not embarked on a journey of understanding how they've been affected, it's really, really challenging to change the culture. It has to start at the top, and those people have to recognize. I mean, most of our leaders in our businesses, they became the leader because they were really good at being a cop or a firefighter or a paramedic for 25 or 30 years. Guess what? That also means they were exposed to a lot of trauma, and unless they have taken the step to try to deal with it, it will be incredibly challenging them to change the paradigm of the culture of the organization.
Absolutely. Well, and confidentiality is protected by law in many states. It's a good idea, if you are a peer supporter, or if you want to engage with peer support or create a peer support team, to know what the laws are in your states. In many states, peer supporters cannot be compelled to reveal what somebody has shared with them confidentially, either by the courts or by your administration. So good thing to know.
And I think to touch on all of this, to Brandon's point around whether you're a leader and you're practicing psychological safety, whether you have the ability to change the fear or the stigma that's associated, but also access, right? If you know it has nothing to do with one's job status, fit for duty, and as a leader, you've made that very present. But you also need to provide access to tools, access to people. There needs to be no barriers, which we're going to talk about in relation to seeking help. And that's a very important thing that comes from a leadership side. And that's something we have to be, not only just a trusted coworker, but we have to be able to remove the barriers. And that could start with the culture or the fear, but it also has to be any physical barriers that you might have to move as well.
So talking about suicide specifically, there is a wonderful piece of research that was done. A psychologist went and interviewed all of the survivors who jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge. There aren't a lot of them. They suffered severe physical injuries, but they all had very, very common responses along these lines, that they thought the problems in their lives were completely overwhelming and that the only solution was to end their life. But as soon as they jumped and they had time to think, from the time they left the bridge to the time they hit the water, they had plenty of time to reconsider that. We all have had the experience of being in a stressed state of mind, and you know how time can dilate. So what's actually a few seconds can feel like minutes, maybe even an hour. And as soon as they jumped, they all realized they didn't have any problem that was more insurmountable than the fact that they had just stepped off the bridge. And one of the amazing survivors has YouTube videos. It's, what's his video? Okay. Google Golden Gate Bridge survivor jump. He gives an amazing story. Talks about he was in such a state of pain that he went to the bridge thinking all he could do is end his life. And if you've been on the Golden Gate Bridge, you know it's highly trafficked. He was there in the middle of the day, cars back and forth, bikes back and forth, pedestrians. He paced back and forth for about 45 minutes, sobbing, not just tears coming down, but bawling. And what he kept telling himself was, if just one person sees me, if just one person asks if I'm okay, I won't do it. So when we think about peer support, and peer supporters are often so afraid that if they ask somebody, are you thinking about killing yourself, that they're going to plant the seed? No, no, no. If somebody's behavior has changed, if somebody's language has changed to that extent, they're already thinking about it. The other big thing that we see peer supporters fearing is that, what if I don't know what to say? What if I don't know what to do? I have to have this whole plan, so I'm not going to say anything. This guy was at the extreme edge of suicidality. He had moved from ideation to action. And all his message is it would have only taken somebody to see me to ask if I was okay, and I wouldn't have done it. What happened was, after walking for 45 minutes back and forth, pacing, sobbing, somebody tapped him on the shoulder. And he says, he was just flooded with this sense of relief. Somebody sees me. He turned around, and instead she thrust a camera at him. She didn't even see him. She didn't notice he was crying. He took the picture, handed the camera back, and jumped off the bridge. He said later he was really sorry he had done that to her, but just the devastation to have felt like somebody just saw him and everything was going to be okay, didn't need to take this action, and to have it ripped away from him was just the last straw. And the whole point of his messaging is it doesn't take a lot. Just seeing somebody and asking and then staying with them through the aftermath, through the next steps, can make all the difference in the world.
I like to think about, so when I first went through I'm not only teaching this, but I'm also a graduate. When I first went through this program, we were trying to find, curriculum that was going to be good for our leadership program specific to mental health. And I heard this part of the talk, and I thought to myself, suicidality is a moment in time. And so how that is empowering is it allows you to understand that suicidality is not something that is contracted and then someone has through the course of their life, but instead it is a culmination of many, many different events that come together, and it can be mitigated just with action from one person. And all it takes is that recognition that somebody is having those thoughts, and then connecting them with some resources simply to help navigate them through that time. But if you think about it as a moment in time, and you think, I'm willing to give someone a moment so that I can help them transcend this, it can be very empowering for someone that is in that, I don't know what I should do, I'm worried about saying the words, I'm worried about what happens if they say yes, how am I going to deal with that? It is something that you can make a huge impact with just a small investment.
Love this cartoon, Suicide Recognition and Response. We all wish it was this obvious and it was this easy to address, but instead it's really incumbent upon us to recognize the risk factors. And to Brandon's point, to ask the question. Many times it's really hard for a person to voice the words that they're thinking about killing themselves. It's so much easier if you ask and then they can just nod. And in asking, you have normalized that experience for them. They're not crazy. You have reached the same conclusion as they have reached, and now it shows you're a safe place to open up this conversation. So what are some of the risk factors that we would look for?
Well, there they are. Obviously, what we're looking for is a departure. If you know someone well, we're looking for a departure from their normal sort of way, affect and way of interacting. Clearly, I think the 3 things is an excellent tool as well. If you know someone that has lost 1 or 2 or 3 of those things, that's somebody that should be on your radar, right? When I think about this stuff in particular, I think I've had 2 sort of seminal experiences in my career. One where all these things were happening and I didn't ask the question, which was really, really because I was afraid of suggesting, and then that person going, well, yeah, actually, yeah, now that you've suggested it, I think I'm going to. The other was somebody that didn't have any of these things and was just completely silent from the perspective of understanding and completed suicide. So I think that this is a great list, and it's important for us to sort of recognize all this challenge, but also, we really need to just know people intimately and have emotionally safe cultures so that they feel like they can come forward and tell us about how they're feeling.
Talking about emergency responder specific suicide factors. And I think in the past we've overlooked these because our culture's just kind of accepted them as part of the job. Maybe drinking a little bit too much, maybe having a divorce or 2, financial distress. But all of those things, to Craig's 3-legged stool analogy, those can be the things that take us down.
Yeah, I don't think it's a shock to know that in the first responder community there's no shortage of relationship issues. It's a challenging place to have a relationship as a career, just for some of the things that are obvious, the shift patterns of work, the stress, the sometimes unavailability of being able to share experiences, things like that can create, we have a higher statistic of divorce rates. Clearly there's, in speaking to a little bit more of these, some of the challenge that we face, the risk around disability, short-term illness, things like that, exposure, they can play a heavy part on a lot of this stuff as well. So And, you know, from a police perspective, be involved in an OIS or officer-involved shooting is so many different factors that contribute to that. And the stress and what I've seen in my experience with people that have been involved in those, at the time what you think it might be, it's far more. And again, we don't just talk about, you know, how they are dealing from the administrative side, their police job, but also the trauma that they could be feeling, along with what we talked about around the court of public opinion, that this exposure. So there's a lot of different factors that can be, in a split second in one's career, change everything.
Absolutely, and it even extends beyond law enforcement, particularly around indictment or being arrested. We're seeing more and more EMS professionals and medical professionals being held accountable for patient demises, and done so in a very public way, which can be shaming and can really be morale crushing. We have seen that being arrested, you know, especially if it's around substance misuse, can have a negative impact on the career, and there's very little consideration given to the question, why were they misusing that substance, whether it was diversion of narcotics or alcohol. No deeper delving into, is there a stress injury? Is this an ineffective attempt to cope with trauma? It is quite frequently in the court of public opinion and agency opinion deemed a character flaw and a weakness, and you're no longer fit to be here. And what a horrible leg to take away from somebody's stool. Other two things, we talk about losses, death and divorce, big ones, child custody, another big one, injured on the job, disability, termination, resignation in lieu of termination, and retirement itself in the absence of appropriate preparation, we're finding can really strip responders of the identity, the thing that they've really clung to all of their life. And now that they're outside the agency, if they haven't had the time or the support to transition their identity to something else, they're feeling lost, isolated, burdensome. Yep, everything that they've compartmentalized, all the traumas and stressors over their career, now they're not in the busy environment that allows them to keep that compartment door shut. Now they're not in a group of comrades, cohort, who've had similar shared experiences, who use similar sense of humor, and now they are not in a setting where they have access to resources. Whether they used them or not before, now they may not have those. And this can really set up a former responder to start going down this spiraling pathway.
Yeah, and again, I will always sort of harp on how these things are intertwined. So all of these things, the positive side of all these things would be support mechanisms, right? So as you start losing things and as you start sort of having challenging experiences, you lose support and resilience. And as you lose support and resilience, then these things become more likely. So the spiraling effect is really an important one to recognize, which is why we all have to, and we'll talk about later, we all have to sort of build resilience and build a better ability to cope with this stuff in healthy ways than a lot of us currently have.
So we've talked a lot about the red flags, the warning signs, what to look for. Now let's talk about what you do, because we're all action-oriented. We tend to be fixers. I have observed, I've read the scene, this is what I want to do next. And it's not that hard. As we talked about before, merely seeing the individual, establishing rapport, and providing a safe and confidential space for them to connect with you is huge.
And we talk about in our first responder community, our other family. Right? And that term's used loosely because we are part of a family that works in a common place. But reality is we're spending, if not the same amount of time, more time with them than our actual, family. And we're in these environments where this occurs. So finding those opportunities are not hard to do. It's just in this day and age, it seems to become more and more less involved, from physically looking at someone, talking to somebody, to we're challenged that we might be going from call to call. It's hard for us to get out of our vehicles, spend the time to actually in a group setting or having some form of debriefs after anything, putting the phone down, not using a form of just an email to ask, but to actually look at somebody, see how there could be an affliction or anything else going on in them. So that's a big piece of what Brandon's speaking about, is just spending that second and having the courage to ask someone and recognize, because we spend so much time with our trusted coworkers, that we're going to notice most of the time when we see things that are concerning.
There's an old Middle Eastern proverb that says, why are we pulling people out of the river? We should go up the river and find out while they're falling in. Right. And so as we think about all this sort of stuff, it's great to have a plan. It's great to have certain resources that you can provide. We also need to think about how we can build trust and communication in our organizations, so you have a better ability to sort of address all of this stuff when it happens, as opposed to what I like to think of as a plan in a glass case. where the bad thing happens, we break the glass and we kind of figure out what we're going to do moving forward. This needs to be exercise stuff. This needs to be cultural in your organization. Just like all the other things we do, we need to kind of have consistency in addressing how these things would work in the emergency situation.
Specific to suicide, there's no shortage of myths around suicide, and we're here today to present a lot of facts and education around it. But one of the biggest one you've probably heard is asking someone whether they're considering suicide will not cause them to be suicidal. And that is an unfortunate myth, and is a fact that it will not cause them to be suicidal. It's a sequence of events, like we've talked about, things that have happened in one's life that culminated in a time that can cross that barrier for somebody.
Well, and I love, we sometimes use the analogy that if you have already seen changes in somebody's behavior, in somebody's patterns of speech, somebody's thought processes that are raising concerns for you, they're already well down that path. Suicide is as old as humans themselves. And again, it is a very, very stressed brain that starts to contemplate its own destruction. But you will never, ever notice these changes in somebody and ask, hey, I've noticed, and that's a good thing to do, I've noticed you're showing up late a lot. I noticed you burned through your sick leave. I've noticed that you seem upset a lot more. Really itemize what you've noticed. I heard you say this thing, and I'm worried. When you say that and you follow it with, are you thinking about killing yourself? And don't say hurting yourself. Don't say, are you thinking of doing something bad? Be very explicit, because that opens up the space for them to be explicit in their response. But you will never say, I'm concerned. Are you thinking about killing yourself? And have them respond with, no, I was thinking about a Netflix and a six-pack, but you're right, a gun's a better idea. If you're seeing the changes, they're already down that path. And you going down that path with them to have a conversation in a place that's safe and confidential for them is huge. You're probably one of the few people who can do that for them at that point in time. And you can really make a huge difference in their outcome.
Yeah, and like the Golden Gate jumper, you know, he made it very clear he just needed human connection. He needed someone to recognize his pain. You can be that person simply by asking that question. And I personally have made the mistake of not asking the question because I was afraid of suggesting. And luckily, the person was able to sort of transcend the situation and later on said, yeah, you know, I was. And you know, I didn't really have any idea of how to cope with that. I could have been the person that asked the question, recognized their pain, and helped them, connect them with resources to cope. And so it's an awesome opportunity for you to step in and help somebody in their challenging time. And
just in and of itself, the question, there's a fear behind it, asking the question. But the bigger thing I hear more often is, what do I do when they answer yes? And that's a fear we have to get over. And the reality is that's where this next part comes into play. I like to use it in the police term when I've told my past employees that if you approach somebody, you ask that question you feel that you need to ask, and they respond yes, it's your job, lack of a better term, to almost handcuff yourself to that person and walk them to the resources that are capable and professional in dealing with this. That is it. If you can transfer them to the resources. Now we talk about what resources should your department have, and whether, you know, my approach is to kind of look at it as throwing the kitchen sink, from EAPs to peer support to chaplains, other access to mental health professionals. All that should be available and have no barriers present to do so.
Absolutely. And one of the big messages of this whole presentation is you don't have to do it alone. You can be the front line, the door opener for the individual who's struggling, but having access to the system and you knowing how to navigate this system is huge. Most of us, when we're in that incredibly stressed place where we are contemplating the end of our own lives, we don't have the ability to navigate a complex system. We need somebody who will advocate for us and who will navigate. So know what you've got. Peer support team. Chaplains can be tremendously beneficial. A lot of what we're exposed to can lead to spiritual or existential crises, and that can send us down this downward spiral. Having mental health providers, whether it's contracted by your agency, whether it's through your EAP system, making sure that those mental health providers understand our culture and our occupational exposures so that they don't, out of the best intentions, look at one of us and say, oh, this is just anxiety, or this is just quote unquote alcoholism, but they have the wherewithal to recognize, I think this is a failed attempt to cope with trauma. How can we cope with the trauma to resolve these symptoms in a full way? Knowing crisis resources. And this is something that we really recommend to everybody. Get your phone out and put some crisis resources into it. I can't tell you how many times when I was health and safety officer for my agency, I would get a text from a random coworker saying, hey, can you text me that number? And I always knew what number they meant. So I'd send them the contact with the instructions in it and let them move forward. We partnered with Crisis Text Line. Any responder or across the country can text the word badge to 741-741 24/7 to be connected with a trained crisis counselor, 24/7, free, confidential, who can work through what you're processing. And again, suicidality isn't the only form of crisis. It can be financial loss. It can be the loss of a loved one. It can be the loss of a pet. It can be so many different forms. But to Craig and Brandon's point earlier, having that social connection, having somebody we trust to just listen and help us walk through it so we're not walking through it alone, can be tremendously valuable. So that's a fantastic resource. Talk, suicide hotline, 800-273-8255 or 844-493-TALK. Having those so that you can give them to somebody in need is tremendous. While you're doing it, also put in some of the contacts for your agency. If you have a peer support hotline, if you have a local clinician that your team works with, fantastic.
Yep. This is sort of you can put this in your phone and you have a plan. So if you tomorrow have to engage in this conversation and you have one tool, but the reality here is we need to sort of start building, like Greg said, the sort of kitchen sink of tools so we have all kinds of different ways for people to engage, because no two people are the same in their interest in engaging help. And so we need all kinds of different, very known, very well described and well communicated plans.
And if you have peer support programs, make those recognizable. Bring them into your environments when you're offering training. Have them speak about what peer support is. It's not just a great recruitment tool, but it's also, again, a group of people hearing how to access these resources. You know, to Brandon's point, have in your department, if you're capable of going back and printing this out, whether you walk into a training room, a bathroom, somewhere you see a sign, a poster, or access to any of these things.
Love it. This concludes our section on suicide awareness and prevention among emergency responders. Please join us for our subsequent sessions on stress physiology, stress injury formation, and our section on resiliency, wrapping it all up, also available on this site. Thank you.